Psalm 132, which is the next psalm in my list, is a psalm that has a distinctive fit for the holiday of Shavuot. Tomorrow morning, traditionally, is a dramatic moment in Jewish consciousness. It's the moment of hearing God's voice address the Israelites gathered around Mount Sinai and proclaiming the Ten Commandments. That powerful moment of encounter has a souvenir, and that is the stone tablets themselves. And those stone tablets were placed in the Aron HaKodesh, the Holy Ark, first in the tabernacle in the desert, and then later in the temple. The temple was not built by David, despite his longing to do so, but rather was built by his son Solomon. Psalm 132, that I'm going to put up in a moment, is the only psalm of the 150 poems to God, the Jewish people's playlist, that distinctly mentions the Aron HaKodesh, the Holy Ark. And so a little bit of the backstory before I put up the psalm. King David spent his life in war. We have that dramatic story of Goliath, yet as a youth, engaged in conflict. And he is not the first king of Israel. The first king of Israel is King Saul. Sadly, much of King David's life is on the run from King Saul, who fears that he may seek to take over. But it is King David who distinctly unifies the 12 tribes as one, who makes Jerusalem, Zion, his capital, and who throughout his life is a singer of poems to God. And so there is in the second book of Samuel, chapter 7, the following exchange between the king and the prophet Nathan. David says, "Here I am, dwelling in a house of cedar, while the ark of the Lord abides in a tent." Nathan, the prophet, said to the king, "Go and do whatever you have in mind, for the Lord is with you." That night, as the story continues, Nathan has a dream in which God appears to Nathan and says, "You misspoke. It's not David who will build my temple, it's his son." And so Nathan will repeat that together. And Nathan will say to David the next day that it will be for King David and his seed to continue to establish royalty for the house of Israel, but it will only be David's son who will build the temple. Well, that's the background to Psalm 132. So a little bit about Psalms. As I noted a moment ago, there are 150 of these poems to God. And what's distinctive about Psalms is they are remarkably honest. They're honest because the context for Psalms is a conversation with God. And in the course of the 150 Psalms, each Psalm has a distinctive voice, a distinctive focus. Sometimes there are phrases taken from other Psalms and often from other parts of the Bible, but the collage effect is such that every Psalm is its distinctive poem. And so one dimension of Psalms is that they're each purposeful. They're each in the context of relationship with God. In some cases, deeply personal. In others, more national. With that, let me put up Psalm 132. As I tend to do, I provide my own translation and literally retranslate to moments before I present, which is the case with one phrase here that I'll tell you about when I get to it. Psalm 132 is part of 15 Psalms, 120 to 134, that are called Shir HaMa'alot, Songs of Ascent. That title, as you see in the beginning, was probably added by an editor later. We don't know for any individual psalm when it was written or who wrote it. And even in this case, where it's Le David, for David, as you'll see, it will describe Zion and ostensibly the temple, which, as I noted, was built only after David. And so this psalm is 18 verses. Shir HaMa'alot, the Song of Ascents. Remember Adonai, for David, all his affliction, when he swore to Adonai and vowed to the powerful one of Jacob, quote, if I come into the tent of my home, if I ascend upon the couch spread for me, if I give sleep to my eyes, to my eyelids slumber, until I find a place for Adonai, dwellings for the powerful one of Jacob. Behold, we heard of it in Ephrat, found it in the field of Ya'ar. Quote, let us come to God's dwellings, let us bow down at God's footstool. Unquote. Quote, arise, Adonai, to your resting place, you in the ark of your strength. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness, and your devotees sing joyfully. For the sake of David, your servant, do not turn away the face of your anointed one. Adonai has sworn to David a truth. God will not turn back from it. Quote, for the fruit of your belly I will set up a throne for you. If your children keep my covenant and my testimony, this I will teach them. Also their children forever shall sit on a throne of yours. Unquote. For Adonai has chosen Zion, has desired it for a seat for God. Quote, this is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. Her sustenance blessed. I will bless her needy. I will sate with bread. And her priests I will clothe with deliverance, and her devotees will sing joyfully. They will sing joyfully. There I will blossom a radiance for David. I have set out a lamp for my anointed one. His enemies I will clothe in shame, and upon him will gleam his crown. Now, in my teaching of Psalms, one of the things that I have so valued is close reading with the help of many commentators to appreciate that as poetry, the psalm is written very purposefully. I did pause to acknowledge quotation marks. This psalm has 5 different quotes, and it's not always clear who is saying the quotes, mostly clear, as the 5 quotes are broken down, as is the psalm, into 2 parts. Verses 1 to 10 is a description of David and engaged with community, promises to God, and verses 11 to 18 are God's promises. And again, What's distinctive about Psalms and why we study it in this occasion of preparing for receiving of Torah is that the poetry of Psalms is a poetry of engagement with God. And so, to begin at the top and to talk a little bit about the artistry of the psalm. Shir Hamalot, as I noted, is an editor's description of ascent, and these 15 psalms of ascent were often identified with pilgrimage, going up to Jerusalem. They often, as in this psalm, mention Zion, mention Jerusalem as the place in which community gathered. Zachor, the opening word, remember, that sets the goal of this psalm. It's a psalm of remembrance. Remembrance of either when David brought the ark to Jerusalem, or a celebration, and that they're remembering an immediate event, whether David or a later point. Remember Yud He Vav He, remember ever present one, remember Adonai. In that regard, there's dialogue. Remember it for David. Et kol unato, all of his affliction. What was David's affliction? As the commentators tend to say, it was all his efforts. Although he would not build that place of gathering, that temple, he would choose where it would be built, and some say create the foundation and even identify where the altar would be. Verses 1 to 5, the first half of the promise to God. And this is the description of what David promised. The word im, verse 3, if, occurs 3 times in 3 and 4, a repetition for emphasis. The word im is actually the language of vows. Some translate it as if I do not. But in the actual text, it's without the not. And therefore, here is what David promises. If I come into the tent of my home, if I ascend upon the couch spread for me, if I give sleep to my eyes, to my eyelids slumber, until I find a place for Adonai, dwellings for the powerful one of Jacob. And so here David is saying, I will not rest. I will allow myself to be, if you will, physically tormented, hence the word of affliction, because I can't rest until the house for God is built. As I noted in 2 Samuel 7, in which David said to the prophet Nathan, how can I live in this big house, this palace, when God is only in a tent? A tent because the tabernacle was portable. Often in Psalms is a phrase that is rare. And already in the first 5 verses is such a phrase. La'avir Yaakov, a name for God, powerful one of Jacob, in verses 2 and verses 5. That phrase only occurs 1 time in the 5 books of Moses. It occurs in Jacob's blessing of Joseph. In contemporary Bible scholarship, that phrase is linked to the Akkadian, the language of Israel's neighbor, Bal Abri, meaning endowed with strength. When we read Psalms, as we are in this moment, we read it on 2 levels. We read it first in its historical context, its pshat, its surface reading. What do the words mean? And sometimes you only know what they mean by looking at how else they're used. And that might also include, as in this distinctive case, a choice of a description of David speaking to God and using a name for God, the Abir, that's also resonant with antiquity, perhaps reinforcing how this is an ancient poem. The next part of the first piece of vows is verses 6 to 10. And now it's as if the people are responding. They're the we. Behold, we heard of it in Ephrat, found it in the field of Ya'ar. That's in reference to the ark, which will be mentioned in verse 8. But this next group of verses 5 to 10 distinctly focus on the event of bringing the ark, the tabernacle that contains the Ten Commandments, that symbol of Mount Sinai. The tabernacle at one point was captured by the Philistines during the time of David. It created havoc for them. And then the ark was transferred to a place near Bethlehem, hence Ephrat. The field of Ya'ar is often identified with a story in the Bible as to where it would be kept for 20 years before David would bring it to Jerusalem. Let us come to God's dwelling. Let us bow down at God's footstool are words that describe the people saying, let us go to the ark. And now a pause to say, the ark was used as a symbol for God's presence. The souvenir of Mount Sinai were those 10 commandments. And when we to this day open the ark, we sing from the book of Numbers, which we began last week, 10:35. Vayihi bin Soharon, Vayomer Moshe. That's a direct quote of the Torah. And it was when they would travel with the ark, Moses would say, Kuma Adonai, get up, God, V'yafutsu oivecha, and disperse your enemies. V'yanusu misanecha mipanecha, may they be cast aside, your enemies from before you. And so the ark, so relevant for Shavuot, here first is a symbol of war, a symbol of God's presence, ready and willing to do battle. But here, verses 8 to 10, is the other use of the ark. These words we know when we put the Torah away. It's another remarkable thing of Psalms is how the Psalms ripple forward and become part of our prayers. And in this case, verses 8 to 10 is sung as the ark is opened to put away the ark. It's right before Eitz Chaim Hi. The words that we say silently are, Kuma Adonai linuchatecha, arise Adonai to your resting place. Ata varon uzecha, you God, and your ark of strength. Kohanecha yilbeshu tzedek, let your priests be clothed with justice, with righteousness. V'chasidecha yiranenu, and your devotees sing joyfully. Ba'avur David avdecha, on account of David your servant, do not turn away the face of your mishichecha, your anointed one. And so here, when we hear tomorrow the ark put away, the Torah put away into the ark, these are the words that we will chant. And in doing so, as we now study this psalm, we are to see this as the end of a journey where the Torah finds its way into minuchatecha, into God's resting place, into homecoming. And so the ark is both a symbol, in some cases, of going out to do battle. But here the emphasis is in the ark returning home. The second half of the psalm, verses 11 to 18, are God's response. And God has vows to make to David. Adonai, verse 11, has sworn to David a truth. God will not turn back from it. Now the third quote. Now it's God speaking. From the fruit of your belly, I will set up a throne for you, meaning I will set up a throne for your descendants. Literally, it's belly, vitnecha, some translate it as loins. If your children keep my covenant and my testimony, this I will teach them. Also their children forever shall sit on a throne of yours. And the rabbis, including Maimonides in his Laws of Melachim, his Laws of Kings, chapter 1, verse 7, will quote verse 12 and circle the first word, namely if. God says, David, your children will also reign on the throne I set up for you, but only conditionally, if they will be righteous, as in verse 9, clothed in righteousness. For Adonai has chosen Zion, has desired it for a seat for God. And once again, as I noted, these Psalms of Ascent often turn our attention to Zion. And now I pause again to say that the focus on Zion, hence the word Zionism, is the longing for the temple, the longing for the mountain, Har Zion, on which the temple was located, is the longing for Jerusalem. And here is an awareness that I only gained last week in teaching Psalms. Namely, we are witness to a miracle, the miracle of the Jewish people's return to Zion after 2,000 years of dispersion. And part of the reason that we survived was because we lived with hope. That's the theme of tonight. And that is, in encountering darkness, one can continue when there is that ray of hope. For 2,000 years, as Jews read Psalms in exile, in galut, in dispersion, it was the hope that one day we would return to Zion that kept us focused on moving forward out of darkness. And miraculously, it came about. Verse 14, this is now God speaking, or is it? The Zohar, that Jewish mystical commentary, quotes this verse, verse 14, and some say, Rabbi Chia says it's God speaking. Rabbi Yossi says it's the people of Israel speaking, but because it's the Zohar and very imaginative, it has a third possibility with verse 14, which is that it's the ark itself. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. And in looking at the commentaries of verse 14, I smile to see that an important Jewish commentator living in the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, Al-Sheikh, will say in reference to this verse, and he uses the word Kotel HaMa'arvi, the Western Wall, that the Western Wall of Jerusalem is a place in which, quoting, this is my resting place forever, that God's presence continues to abide there, at the symbol, the retainer wall of the courtyard of the temple. Verse 15, her sustenance blessed. I will bless her needy. I will sate with bread. And here too, the rabbis point out that God repeatedly in Psalms, as in this moment, says that as part of this redemption, and that is how this psalm was read most commonly throughout most of its history. This is not looking back, this is looking forward, that there will be a return. And that's why some people would say that in the plural here is the description in verse 5. Until I find a place for Adonai's dwellings, it's in the plural, that it was describing multiple temples, that this ultimately is describing the final redemption. For also, back to the theme of hope, what allowed Jews to survive was the belief that there would be a return to Zion, but more, that there would be a Messiah. That is a Jewish concept, that history doesn't move in a circle but a spiral, that there would be a future time in which we would both be brought back to Zion, in which God in beneficence would take care of the needy, make sure they had food and all needs, and that the priests who would be clothed in deliverance, that those priests would be able to be engaged in service that would enable joy. And now the last two, knowing that I have only another 4 minutes. There, and the there means Jerusalem. I will blossom a radiance for David. That most commonly is translated as I will blossom or sprout a horn for David. And this phrase, horn, that's repeated 76 times in Hebrew scripture, including the horns of the altar, the 4 corners. Only once does it refer, or at least is translated as not literally a horn, but light. And that's Moses coming down from Mount Sinai. When Moses returns, having been with God to receive the 10 commandments the second time, his face will be radiant. And that's the same word, Karen or Karen. There I will blossom a radiance for David. I have set out a lamp for my anointed one. His enemies I will clothe in shame, and upon him will gleam his crown. And so one aspect of this conclusion is the recognition that there is at times war, and that at times Israel does have enemies. That's reality. And that is also a promise, the promise that there will be a future time in which Israel will be victorious, or that Israel will be at peace. And so this is my closing thought in the teaching of this psalm. And I will add that this image of Ner here, of light, is also included in our blessings for the Haftorah. And that is a reading of Isaiah chapter 2, beginning with verse 2. For this messianic era that's described is described as follows by the prophet Isaiah. In the days to come, the mount of the Lord's house shall stand firm above the mountains and tower above the hills. And that's the image we have here in Psalm 132. And all the nations shall gaze on it with joy. Again, a theme. And the many people shall go and say, come, let us go up to the mount of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that God may instruct us in God's ways, that we may walk in God's paths. For instruction shall come forth from Zion. We will say this too when we take out the ark tomorrow. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. The word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Thus God will judge among the nations and arbitrate for the many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again know war. And so I'm pulling this together and linking it to healing. Darkness requires light. And therefore, in verse 17, there's a blossoming of radiance. They're setting up the anointed one, which can either be the priest or it can be the king. It can also, by some commentators, be the people themselves who are called to be a holy people. But ultimately, this is a psalm of hope that there will be a time ahead of peace. We are in the midst of enormous suffering right now in the Holy Land. There are missiles flying in all directions and terror and fear and damage and blood. And there are those, which is only understandable, who say it will never be different. It will never change. And what we're called on, as I read Psalm 132, is to believe that change is possible. That's the name of God here chosen, Avir Yaakov, the powerful one, the one who can effect change. If we as a Jewish people survived 2,000 years of darkness, of the insecurity of lacking the dignity of our own home, we only were able to return to Zion because of the continued promise and the belief in the promise that one day we would return to Zion. And more. For those who would doubt that there can be peace between Arabs and Jews, I say that too is part of the promise. The promise that leaves us in darkness, moving forward toward light, having hope, is the virtue of believing it's possible. And so, as in the words of Isaiah, that vision of a future in which there will be war no more, in which the swords will be turned into plowshares, that we must hold on to as a people as strongly as a dream, as the dream of Zion. And as we return to Israel, so may Israel be blessed to be a nation at peace, and may it lead to a world at peace as well. May we find our world which is broken. May we find it with the faith that it can be a world of wholeness.